The wind whispered through the pines, standing sentinel around the Johnsons' modest home on the outskirts of Millfield, Maine. On a cold October night in 1985, Susan Johnson slept the heavy sleep of the exhausted, worn out from a double shift at the local diner. She didn't hear the creak of the floorboards, the nervous whispers, or the soft click of the back door as it closed. The next morning, autumn sun filtered through the worn curtains as Susan awoke. The house was unusually silent. Normally, by this hour, Michael would be fixing cereal for his younger siblings, or Emily would be arguing with Daniel over the remote for the small television in the living room. "Kids," Susan called out, her voice still rough with sleep. Only silence answered. She rose and pulled on her faded robe, walking down the narrow hallway toward the two bedrooms her children shared. The boys' door was ajar. Michael and Jason's beds were empty, the sheets rumpled but cold to the touch. In the next room, Emily and Daniel's beds were also vacant. A chill traced its way down Susan's spine. "Michael! Jason!" she called, her voice rising. "Emily! Daniel! This isn't funny!" She checked the bathroom, the kitchen, the basement, the small backyard. Nothing. Her 4 children had vanished without a trace. There were no signs of a struggle, no forced doors, no broken windows, just the sudden, complete absence of the 4 people who were her entire world. With trembling hands, Susan dialed the number for the local police. In the hours that followed, the Johnson house became a hub of intense activity. Police officers combed the property and the surrounding woods. Neighbors formed search parties and local journalists began to arrive, drawn by the news of 4 children disappearing at once. "Mrs. Johnson, I need you to think carefully," said Sheriff Roberts, a heavy-set man with tired, compassionate eyes. "Did you notice anything unusual in the days leading up to their disappearance? Anyone lurking around the neighborhood? Did your children mention any strangers?" Susan shook her head, tears streaming down her pale face. "Nothing. Everything was normal." Her voice broke on the last word. What was normal about her life? A widow at 32, working 2 jobs to support 4 kids, desperately trying to hold her family together since John died in that factory accident 3 years ago. "And what about Thomas?" the sheriff asked, checking his notes. "Thomas Reed, your boyfriend, is that right?" "Ex," Susan corrected automatically. "We broke up 2 weeks ago." "How did he take the breakup?" Susan looked away. "Not well. But he wouldn't do something like this. He wasn't violent." The sheriff exchanged a look with his deputy. "All the same, we'll need to have a word with him." Thomas Reed was questioned that same afternoon. He had a solid alibi for the night before. He'd been drinking at Pitt's Tavern until 2 a.m., a fact confirmed by several witnesses. He seemed genuinely shocked and disturbed by the news of the children's disappearance. Days bled into weeks. The search intensified, expanding across the county. Dogs, trackers, helicopters, and volunteers combed every inch of the forest. The FBI joined the investigation. The faces of Michael, Jason, Emily, and Daniel appeared on milk cartons, on posters, on national news broadcasts. Susan barely slept. Every sound in the night jolted her awake, hoping it was her children returning. Every phone call made her hold her breath, praying for good news. Every child's face she saw on the street made her head snap around, only to feel the crushing weight of disappointment when she realized it wasn't one of hers. The case captured the nation's attention for a time. "Mystery in Maine. 4 siblings vanish without a trace," the headlines proclaimed. Pundits debated theories on television shows. Psychics offered their services and letters poured in from across the country. Some with well-meaning advice, others with wild theories, some simply offering comfort. But as the months passed with no significant breakthrough, the media attention dwindled. The searches became less frequent. The sheriff's office began to focus its limited resources on other cases. "We're not giving up on the investigation, Susan," Sheriff Roberts assured her on a cold April afternoon in 1986, 6 months after they disappeared. "But I have to be honest with you. Without any new leads, there's little more we can actively do." Susan nodded mechanically, her face an empty mask. In those 6 months she had aged 10 years. Her brown hair was streaked with silver. Deep lines were etched into her forehead and at the corners of her eyes. And she had lost so much weight that her clothes hung on her frame as if they belonged to someone else. "I'll find them," she said, her voice hollow, "no matter how long it takes." And so the wait began, a wait that would stretch on far longer than anyone could have imagined. Susan refused to move from the house despite the painful memories that haunted every corner. She kept the children's rooms exactly as they were the day they disappeared. Michael and Jason's beds with their superhero comforters, the shelves full of books and action figures. Emily and Daniel's room with its dolls, stuffed animals, and colorful drawings taped to the walls. Every birthday, Susan baked a cake. Every Christmas, she placed gifts under the tree. Every first day of school, she took out their backpacks and filled them with new supplies. Empty rituals that kept her tethered to the hope that they would one day return. The years passed. The townspeople stopped mentioning the Johnson children in her presence, uncomfortable with her persistent grief. Some, with good intentions but cruel frankness, suggested she move on, as if she could simply leave behind the 4 pieces of her heart that had vanished in the night. Time marched inexorably forward. The new millennium came and went. Susan Johnson was still in the same house, though the neighborhood had changed considerably. New families had moved in, young trees had grown to impressive heights, and little Millfield had expanded with a new strip mall on the outskirts. In 2010, Susan was 57. Her once brown hair was now completely gray, pulled back in a simple bun. Her hands showed the marks of decades spent working as a waitress and, later as the manager of the diner she eventually bought with her savings. Her eyes, however, still held that watchful gaze, always searching, always waiting. It was a Tuesday evening in September, almost exactly 25 years since the disappearance. Susan was sitting on her front porch, a habit she'd kept through all the years, watching the street as if at any moment she might see her children walking home. The autumn air carried that familiar scent of dry leaves and damp earth. Susan wrapped her hands around a warm mug of tea lost in memories. Michael would be turning 36 now. Jason would be 34, Emily 33, and little Daniel 31. What would their adult faces look like? Would Emily still have those freckles she hated so much? Would Michael have that dimple in his cheek he inherited from his father? The sound of an engine interrupted her thoughts. A black truck, modest but well-maintained, pulled up in front of her house. She didn't recognize the vehicle, and in a small town like Millfield, that was unusual. 4 doors opened at once. 4 adults emerged, 3 men and a woman. They stood still for a moment, looking at the house, looking at her. Susan slowly got to her feet, the teacup forgotten on the porch table. Something in the way they moved and how they stood together was achingly familiar. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs. The tallest of the group took a step forward, a man in his mid-30s with dark brown hair and broad shoulders that so reminded her of her late husband that Susan had to grip the porch railing to stay upright. "Mom?" The man's voice was deep, adult, but it held an echo of the boy he once was. A sound, half sob, half gasp, escaped Susan. Her legs gave out and she found herself on her knees on the porch, unable to process what she was seeing. The 4 of them rushed toward her, taking the porch steps with an urgency. The man who had spoken, Michael, it had to be Michael, reached her first, kneeling in front of her, his large warm hands covering hers. "Mom," he said. It's us. We're home. The next few hours passed in a blur of shock and indescribable joy. Susan couldn't stop touching their faces, hugging them, crying. They sat in the living room, the same one where they'd played as children, now crowded onto the couches as adults. Michael, at 36, was the spitting image of his father. Tall, solidly built with that same determined but kind gaze. Jason, at 34, was leaner, with a neatly trimmed beard and a more reserved demeanor. Emily, 33, was beautiful with her reddish-brown hair and, yes, those freckles still dusting her nose and cheeks. And Daniel, the youngest at 31, still had a hint of boyish energy in his movements and his easy smile. Where? How? Susan couldn't form a coherent question. 25 years of uncertainty and grief were log-jammed in her throat. The siblings exchanged a look, a silent communication that spoke of years sharing secrets and difficult choices. It's a long story, Mom, Michael said finally, his voice gentle but firm. And you have every right to be angry with us. I'm not angry, Susan replied immediately, though she didn't even know if it was true. I need to understand. Emily leaned forward, taking her mother's hands. We left to protect you, Mom, and to protect ourselves. Protect me? From what? The silence that followed was heavy, laden with painful memories Susan apparently knew nothing about. From Thomas? Jason said finally, his voice holding a hard edge that wasn't present in his siblings. From Thomas Reed. Susan blinked in confusion. Thomas? But we only dated for a few months. We broke up weeks before you left. Daniel, the youngest, glanced at Michael before speaking. Mom, he used to come to the house when you were at work. He would threaten us. He did things to us. The color drained from Susan's face. What kind of things? At first it was just yelling, Michael explained, taking on the role of spokesman he'd always had as the eldest. He told us we were a burden on you, that you'd be better off without us. Then he started pushing us around, pinching Emily and Daniel when they were being loud. One night, Jason continued, he hit Michael with his belt for talking back. He told us if we ever told you, he would do something worse. He said he had ways of making us disappear for good. Susan covered her mouth with her hands, horrified. I never suspected. We know, Mom, Emily said softly. He was so careful. He acted completely different when you were around. We thought if we disappeared, Daniel explained, you would realize it was him and report him. We thought you'd be safer without us around, and he wouldn't have a reason to stick around anymore. Susan shook her head, the tears flowing freely again. But where did you go? Who took care of you? You were just children. Michael took a deep breath. That night, after you fell asleep, we packed some things in our school bags. We had a plan. We'd been saving our lunch money for weeks. We took the night bus to Portland, and then we met Helen. Helen Winters, Emily interrupted, a smile softening her features for the first time. Who's Helen Winters? Susan asked. The siblings looked at each other again, this time with expressions that mixed gratitude and something like reverence. The woman who saved us, Jason answered. The woman who gave us a home when we thought we didn't have one anymore. The story that followed left Susan alternately horrified, amazed, and grateful. Helen Winters, a woman in her 60s at the time, had found the 4 frightened children at the Portland bus station. Instead of immediately calling the authorities, something in their eyes, or perhaps in her own history of loss and redemption, had compelled her to listen to them first. Helen Winters lived in a small, isolated community in the mountains of New Hampshire, a few hours from Portland. A place called Tranquil Valley, where a dozen or so cabins were scattered around a clearing in the woods. inhabited by people who, for various reasons, had chosen to step away from the outside world. Helen took us to her cabin that night, Michael continued, his eyes lost in the memory. She made us hot chocolate and she listened, she really listened. She wanted to call the police, Emily added. She was horrified by what Thomas had done, but we were so scared. We told her Thomas was dangerous, Jason interjected, that he had friends on the local police force, that no one would believe us. We were just scared kids repeating his threats. But we believed it then. Daniel, who had been quiet for a while, spoke in a soft voice. Helen offered to let us stay one night, then another and another. Before we knew it, a week had passed. By then it was all over the news, Michael said, looking at his mother with eyes full of remorse. We saw your face on TV, Mom. You were so devastated, we almost came back right then. Why didn't you? Susan asked, her voice cracking but with no trace of accusation. Emily squeezed her mother's hand. Because we saw Thomas, too. He was standing right next to you at one of the press conferences, playing the part of the concerned, supportive boyfriend. He had his arm around your shoulders. Susan remembered it clearly. Thomas had reappeared in her life just days after the disappearance, offering comfort and support. In her desperation, she had briefly accepted his presence, until the investigation progressed and he slipped away again. And that confirmed all our fears, Jason continued. We thought he had manipulated the situation just to get close to you again. We were convinced that if we came back, he would find a way to hurt us, or worse. Helen offered us a solution, said Michael. She told us we could stay with her until it was safe to return, until Thomas was no longer in the picture. She said we'd send you a message then. But the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, Emily sighed. It became harder and harder to imagine how we could ever come back without getting into enormous trouble, without getting Helen into trouble. Susan tried to process it all. This parallel universe where her children had been alive and safe while she was consumed by the agony of not knowing. But what about school? Your lives? Daniel smiled faintly. Tranquil Valley was like a small world of its own. Everyone there taught something. Helen had been a teacher before she retired. Paul, her neighbor, was a retired engineer. Maria was a nurse. They all educated us. Helen forged documents, Michael admitted. She passed us off as her orphaned grandchildren. No one in the valley asked too many questions about anyone's past. As we grew older, we started to understand more about what we'd done, said Jason. The pain we had caused you, but the fear of the legal consequences of being separated, of Helen being arrested for hiding us. That fear paralyzed us. When I turned 18, Michael continued, I wanted to find you. I really tried, but I found out Thomas was still in Millfield, still a part of the community, and the fear came rushing back. Susan shook her head in confusion. Thomas moved out of Millfield at the end of 1986. He got a job in Boston and never came back. The four siblings looked at each other, stunned. But I saw him, Michael insisted. In 1992, when I came to check. He was in the local store. I was sure it was him. Michael, Susan said softly. Thomas has an identical twin brother, Richard. You probably saw Richard. He stayed in town for a few more years. The silence that followed was dense, heavy with the weight of decisions based on faulty information, of years lost to a fear that could have been dispelled so much sooner. What happened to Helen? Susan finally asked, breaking the silence. A warm smile lit up Emily's face. Helen passed away 3 months ago. She was 85. It was peaceful, in her sleep. Her last words to us were that it was time to close the circle, Daniel said. That we needed to find you and tell you the truth no matter the consequences. It took us these past few months to gather the courage, Jason admitted, to get our lives in order to prepare for any legal repercussions. Susan took a deep breath, processing it all. 25 years, a quarter of a century lost, birthdays, graduations, first loves, heartbreaks, triumphs. An entire life she could have shared with her children, stolen by the fear sown by one cruel man. And now, what do you do with your lives? She asked, eager to know these adults who were once her little ones. Michael smiled faintly. I'm a carpenter. Helen taught me the basics, and then I apprenticed with one of the valley residents. I have my own workshop now. I work with computers, Jason said. Security systems, mainly. Ironic, I suppose, considering how we lived for so long. Emily squeezed her mother's hand. I'm a teacher, like Helen. I teach at an elementary school near Concord. And I'm a nurse, Daniel completed. I work at Manchester Community Hospital. Susan nodded, absorbing every detail, trying to connect these capable, accomplished adults with the children she had lost. There was so much she wanted to ask. Were they married? Did she have grandchildren? Were they happy despite everything? But before she could form another question, Michael leaned forward, his intense eyes fixed on hers. Mom, we'll understand if you can't forgive us. What we did, the pain we caused you, there's no excuse for it. Susan felt tears welling up again, but this time they were different. Not tears of grief or loss, but of a strange mix of relief, joy, and a mourning for the lost time they could never get back. There is nothing to forgive, she said at last, her voice firm despite the tears. You were frightened children, trying to protect each other, trying to protect me in your own way. If anyone needs forgiveness, it's me, for not seeing what was happening, forever letting that man into our lives. Emily sobbed openly, and Daniel wasn't much better. Even Jason, the most reserved of the four, had eyes shining with unshed tears. So, what matters now, Susan continued, is that you're here. You're alive and well. After all these years of wondering, of imagining the worst, having you here, knowing you've been okay, it's more than I ever dared to hope for. Michael stood up and knelt beside his mother's chair, resting his head in her lap, just as he had done so many times as a boy. Susan ran her fingers through his hair, now short and touched with premature gray at the temples. We're home, Mom, Michael murmured. We're finally home. That night, no one wanted to be apart. Susan made a makeshift dinner with what she had in the pantry, her hands occasionally trembling as she chopped vegetables or stirred the pasta. Her children watched her move around the kitchen, recognizing gestures and habits that had remained unchanged by time. You still hum when you cook, Emily commented with a nostalgic smile. Susan paused, surprised. She hadn't realized she was softly humming You Are My Sunshine, the same song she used to sing to them as a lullaby. Dinner was an emotional affair, constantly interrupted by questions, memories, and occasional overwhelming silences when the magnitude of what they had all lost settled heavily upon them. Where are you sleeping? Susan finally asked, when the plates were empty and the night had grown late. We have rooms at the motel outside of town, Michael answered. We didn't want to assume. Nonsense, Susan interrupted firmly. Your rooms are still here, just as you left them. The siblings exchanged looks of astonishment. You've kept our rooms for 25 years? Jason asked, his voice thick with emotion. Susan nodded. Come, let me show you. She led them down the familiar hallway to the 2 bedrooms they had shared as children. The door to the first room swung open, revealing a space frozen in time. Michael and Jason's beds, their superhero comforters faded but impeccably clean. Shelves lined with young adult books, model airplanes hanging from the ceiling. My God, Michael whispered, stepping slowly inside. He touched the small desk where he used to do his homework, running his fingers over the wood surface as if he could connect with the boy he once was, through that simple gesture. Emily and Daniel's room was equally preserved. Dolls and stuffed animals sat neatly on shelves, childish drawings were framed on the walls, and a collection of shiny rocks that Daniel had treasured was arranged carefully in a ceramic bowl. Emily picked up a worn teddy bear from her bed, hugging it to her chest. "Mr. Wiggles," she whispered, "I can't believe you're still here." "Everything is still here," Susan said softly, "waiting for you." That night, despite being adults, the four siblings slept in their old beds. The house that had been silent for so long was now filled with familiar sounds: the creak of the floorboards under knowing feet, the murmur of conversations, even an occasional laugh. Susan lay awake in her own room listening to these sounds, afraid that if she fell asleep, she would wake to find it had all been a cruel, elaborate dream. The next morning, the aroma of coffee and bacon woke Susan. For a disorienting moment, she thought she had traveled back in time to those weekend mornings when Michael, always the early riser, would make breakfast for everyone. And sure enough, when she walked into the kitchen, she found Michael at the stove, flipping pancakes with the same concentration he'd had at 11. Only now his movements were sure and precise, those of an adult accustomed to cooking. "Morning, Mom," he said without turning, sensing her presence just as he always had. "Good morning," she replied, watching as this grown man occupied the space that once belonged to a boy, creating a strange layered effect in her mind. Slowly, the others joined them. Jason, already showered and neatly dressed. Emily, her hair damp and pulled back in a loose braid. Daniel, still sleepy and disheveled. Some things never changed. Over breakfast, the conversation flowed more easily than the night before. The morning light seemed to have dispelled some of the emotional intensity, allowing them to speak more calmly about the lost years. "What's going to happen now?" Susan asked, the question that had been on her mind all night. The siblings exchanged glances, communicating without words as they had since childhood. "We have to go to the authorities," Michael said finally. "Explain what happened, clear the case." Susan's heart quickened. "Will there be legal consequences?" Jason, with his knowledge of security systems and apparently legal matters, answered. "It's complicated. Technically, Helen could have faced charges for hiding us, but she's gone. We were minors when we disappeared, so we didn't commit a crime. There will be questions, investigations," Emily added, "but we're prepared for that." "And after?" Susan pressed. "Will you go back to your lives in New Hampshire?" An awkward silence followed her question. It was clear they hadn't planned beyond this reunion, this confession. "I want to stay close," Daniel said at last, the first to voice what seemed to be a shared sentiment. "I've already applied for a transfer to the regional hospital. It's less prestigious than where I was, but—" "Me too," Emily broke in. "There's a school here that needs teachers. I've already sent in my application." Jason nodded. "My work is mostly remote. I can do it from anywhere with a good internet connection." All eyes turned to Michael, who seemed to be wrestling with an internal decision. "My situation is more complicated," he said finally. "I have an established workshop, employees who depend on me. But—" he paused, taking a deep breath. "I also have a family." Susan held her breath. "A family?" Michael smiled, a genuine grin that lit up his entire face. "A wife, Kate, and 2 children, your grandchildren, Mom. David is 7 and Lily is 5. Tears instantly sprang to Susan's eyes. "I have grandchildren? 3, actually," Emily added shyly. "My daughter, Sophie, is 3. Susan covered her mouth with her hands, overwhelmed by this new revelation. Not only had she gotten her children back, but there was a new generation she had never known. Kate and the kids are at a hotel in Portland, Michael continued. I needed to do this first, to see how you'd react, to make sure it was okay to bring them here. Of course it's okay, Susan exclaimed. It's more than okay. It's wonderful. The morning passed in a blur of more revelations. Photos of grandchildren shown on cell phones, stories of marriages for Michael and Emily, a brief divorce for Jason, careers, achievements, and failures. It was like trying to absorb 25 years of life in a few short hours. After lunch, they decided it was time to take the next step. Michael called the current sheriff, briefly explaining who they were and requesting a meeting. Sheriff Phillips, a young man who was barely in elementary school when the disappearance occurred, arrived at the Johnson house an hour later, looking visibly bewildered. He had grown up hearing stories of the Johnson siblings' case, a local legend, an unsolved mystery that had defined Millfield for many. The full explanation took hours. The sheriff took detailed notes, occasionally asking questions to clarify dates or specific details. His expression shifted between professional astonishment and human compassion. I'll have to report this to state and federal authorities, he said finally. This case was never officially closed. We understand, Michael replied, acting as the family spokesman just as he had since he was a boy. We'll cooperate fully. The sheriff nodded, putting away his notebook. From what you've told me, I don't see any grounds for criminal charges against any of you. You were children when you disappeared, acting under duress and fear. And Helen Winters is no longer with us to answer for her actions. He paused, looking at the siblings with a softened expression. From my perspective, what she did was protect 4 scared kids the best way she knew how. When the sheriff left, promising to return the next day with more officers to formalize their statements, a weight seemed to lift from everyone's shoulders. It's going to be a circus when this gets out, Jason commented, ever the pragmatist. We'll face it together, Susan said with a firmness that surprised even herself. After 25 years of uncertainty and pain, any media storm seemed insignificant by comparison. That afternoon, Michael made another call. 2 hours later, a car pulled up in front of the house. A graceful, blonde-haired woman and 2 children got out. A boy, tall for his age with Michael's same dark hair, and a little girl with pigtails and a bright pink dress. Susan watched from the porch, her heart beating so hard she thought it might fail. Michael went out to meet them, hugging his wife and lifting his daughter into his arms while his son clung to his leg. Kate, David, Lily, Michael said, turning toward the porch. I want you to meet someone very special. This is your grandmother, Susan. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity, emotion, and adjustment. Just as Jason had predicted, once the news of the Johnson siblings' return leaked, Millfield became the epicenter of a media frenzy. Reporters from across the country converged on the small town, eager to cover what they were calling the miracle in Maine, or the quarter-century return. Susan, who had lived for so long in the solitude of her grief, now found her house constantly full, not just with her newfound children and grandchildren, but with police officers taking formal statements, FBI agents reviewing old case files, and curious neighbors who appeared with pies and casseroles, their eyes gleaming with barely disguised curiosity. This is too much, Jason muttered one afternoon, drawing the living room curtains to block the cameras that occasionally appeared on the front lawn. We should have been better prepared for this. Emily, who was sitting on the floor playing with her daughter Sophie and Michael's children, looked up. There's no way to prepare for something like this, Jace. It's one of a kind. And it was. Experts on missing persons cases confirmed on the news that there was no precedent. 4 siblings who disappeared voluntarily, stayed together, and returned intact 25 years later. The story was too extraordinary to ignore. For Susan, however, amid the chaos, there were moments of pure joy that made up for any discomfort. Like when David, her 7-year-old grandson, found her in the kitchen early one morning and asked her to teach him how to make pancakes, like Dad does. "Your dad learned from me, you know," Susan told him, pulling up a stool so the boy could reach the counter. David looked at her with eyes identical to Michael's at that age. "Really? Dad said you had a secret recipe." Susan smiled, feeling a circle complete itself. "It's not so secret, it's mostly love. And maybe a little cinnamon." Or when little Lily fell asleep in her lap one afternoon as she read from the same storybook she had read to Emily decades ago, found untouched on the shelf in her old room. "It still has the same smell," Emily remarked, watching them from the doorway. "The whole house does. It's like it was waiting for us." Susan stroked Lily's hair. It was. As the days passed, the initial shock began to give way to practical matters. Susan's house, while spacious for one person, was a tight fit for 11, counting Michael's wife, Kate, and Emily's daughter, Sophie. "We could look for something bigger," Michael suggested one night as the adults shared a bottle of wine after the children were asleep. "A place where we can all be comfortable, at least for a while. Or we could rebuild this house," Jason proposed. "Expand it. There's enough land." "No," Susan started, but then paused, observing the conversation with a mix of emotions. On one hand, the idea of keeping all her children close, of not losing them again, was irresistible. On the other, she knew they were adults with established lives who would eventually need their own space. "I need to know what you're all really planning," she said finally, her voice soft but firm. "Is this temporary? An extended visit before you go back to your lives? Or are you considering staying in Millfield for good?" The siblings exchanged glances, that silent communication they had always shared. "I'm staying," Daniel declared, the first to break the silence. "I've already been accepted at the regional hospital. I start in 3 weeks. And my application for the local school was approved," Emily added. "Sophie and I are staying too." Jason nodded. "My work is remote, so I can set up anywhere, preferably near my family." All eyes turned to Michael, who had the most complicated situation with his established business in New Hampshire. "Kate and I have been talking," he said, taking his wife's hand. "We're going to sell the workshop. There's an interested buyer, one of my apprentices who always wanted his own business. I can start over here." "Michael," Susan interjected, "I don't want you to sacrifice what you've built just for me." Michael smiled, the same smile he'd had since he was a boy, when he was completely sure of something. "It's not a sacrifice, Mom. It's a choice. We lost 25 years. I don't want to lose another day." Kate, who had been observing the family dynamic with understanding eyes, spoke up. "Besides, the kids are thrilled with the idea of living near their grandmother. David is already planning to build a treehouse with you." Susan's laughter mixed with tears she didn't try to hide. After so long alone, the thought of having her whole family back seemed like an impossible dream come true. The following weeks were filled with decisions and changes. A plan was set to expand Susan's house, with Michael designing an extension that would include 2 independent apartments connected to the main structure. One for his family and one for Emily and Sophie. Jason and Daniel, both single, would stay in their original rooms in the main house, at least for now. Meanwhile, the media, hungry for details, continued to hound them. After much deliberation, the family decided to grant a single exclusive interview to a renowned national program, on the condition that their privacy would be respected afterward. The interview took place in Susan's living room, where journalists and technicians set up lights and cameras, transforming the intimate space into a makeshift set. The interviewer, a middle-aged woman with kind but perceptive eyes, guided the family through their extraordinary story. "Did you ever consider contacting your mother before now?" she asked, addressing the four siblings. "Constantly," Michael answered. "There wasn't a single day we didn't think about her, about what she was going through, how she was coping with our absence." "But fear is a powerful thing," Emily added, and with every year that passed, the possibility of returning seemed more remote, the potential consequences more severe. "And you, Susan?" The interviewer turned to her. "Did you ever lose hope?" Susan considered the question before answering, aware that thousands of families with missing loved ones would be hanging on her words. "There were dark moments," she admitted. "Days when the pain was so intense I could barely breathe. But there was always a part of me, perhaps an irrational part, that refused to believe they were gone forever." "What would you say to other families who are going through what you went through?" the interviewer asked. The siblings looked at one another, but it was Daniel, the youngest and often the most emotional, who replied, "That we're sorry, that we understand the pain we caused, even if our intentions were to protect each other, and that sometimes miracles happen, even after 25 years. The interview aired nationally a week later, sparking a new wave of interest but also a greater respect for the family's privacy. Letters and emails began to pour in from all over the country. Some were from families with missing loved ones who found hope in their story. Others were from people who had been bereaved as children and identified with their fear and desperate choices. As autumn deepened into winter, the construction of the annex progressed quickly, with Michael overseeing every detail. Susan, meanwhile, found an indescribable joy in the small daily routines with her grandchildren. Helping David with his homework, braiding Lily's hair in the mornings, reading Sophie a story before bed. One November afternoon, as an early snow-covered Millfield in a white blanket, Susan found Emily on the back porch, watching the flakes fall silently. "Everything all right?" Susan asked, joining her daughter. Emily nodded, a soft smile on her lips. "I was just remembering the last snow I saw at this house. I was 8. Daniel and I built an army of snowmen in the yard." "I remember," Susan said, the memory emerging sharp despite the years. 5 of them, one for each member of the family. "And now there are 11 of us," Emily mused. "We'd have to work all day to make that many." Susan took her daughter's hand, feeling its warmth through her gloves. "We have time. We have all the time in the world now." And as they stood there watching the snow transform the landscape, Susan felt a peace she had thought impossible for 25 years. Her children were back, different yet recognizable, changed but whole. They had brought with them a new generation, a continuation of the family story she had feared was cut short. The circle, broken for so long, was complete again. And in that moment of perfect stillness, with the snowflakes dancing subtly around them, Susan knew that despite the lost years and the pain endured, her family had found their way back home. Winter in Maine had always been harsh, but for Susan, this was the warmest she could remember in decades. The house, so long silent and empty, now overflowed with life. Children's laughter echoed in the hallways, the aroma of home-cooked meals constantly hung in the kitchen. And the sounds of conversation and occasional arguments characterized a large, bustling family. The expansion of the house moved forward swiftly despite the weather. Michael had hired a local construction crew, but he worked alongside them every day, his skilled hands shaping the wood, ensuring every detail met his exacting standards. "It's strange," he remarked to Susan one afternoon as they inspected the progress. "I learned carpentry trying to keep Dad's memory alive, and now I'm using those skills to expand the house where he raised us." Susan touched one of the newly installed beams, feeling the grain of the wood under her fingers. "Your father would be so proud, Michael, of all of you." One December afternoon, as they were decorating a massive Christmas tree in the living room, the first in many years that didn't feel like a painful formality for Susan, the doorbell rang. Jason, being closest to the door, went to answer it. He returned moments later with a confused expression, followed by an older man in his 70s with stark white hair and a slightly stooped posture. "Excuse the intrusion," the man said, his voice raspy but firm. "I'm Detective Robert Callahan. I was in charge of the Johnson siblings case back in 1985. A sudden silence fell over the room. The children, sensing the tension, stopped playing with the ornaments and watched the stranger with curiosity. "Detective Callahan," Susan said finally, recognizing him despite the passing years. "Please, come in." The old detective moved forward slowly, his eyes scanning the room, lingering on each of the siblings, studying them with a professional gaze he had clearly never lost. "I saw you on the interview," he explained. "I couldn't believe it. After all these years." He paused, his voice cracking slightly. "This case haunted my entire career. It was the one I could never solve." Michael stepped forward, extending his hand. "Michael Johnson. I think the last time we saw each other I was 11. The detective shook his hand, a sad smile curving his lips. "I remember you. You were a serious kid, very protective of your siblings." He looked at the others. "All of you. I asked myself so many questions about you over the years, ran through so many scenarios. I never imagined, I never suspected." Emily came forward, offering him a mug of hot chocolate. "Please sit with us. We were just decorating the tree, but we can talk." The detective accepted the mug with slightly trembling hands. "I don't want to interrupt your family celebration. I needed to see it with my own eyes. To close this chapter, I suppose." The children were sent to play in another room while the adults sat down with the detective. Callahan told them how the Johnson case had become an obsession for him, how he had continued to investigate long after the department officially declared it a cold case. "Even after I retired, I'd still pull out the file looking for something I'd missed," he confessed. "It was the biggest failure of my career." "It wasn't a failure," Jason said firmly. "You did everything you could with the information you had." "But I failed to see what was happening with Thomas Reed," the detective insisted, regret thick in his voice. "I should have dug deeper, asked more questions." "We never said anything," Emily replied softly. "We were too scared." Detective Callahan looked at them with tired but attentive eyes. "Can I ask, what was it like? Afterward, where were you all those years?" The siblings exchanged glances, and Michael, as always, took on the role of spokesman. They told him about Helen Winters, about Tranquil Valley, about the years they spent growing up in that isolated but loving community. They spoke of the lives they had built, the guilt that never fully left them, and the final decision to return. Callahan listened intently, occasionally asking professional but respectful questions. When they finished their story, the detective remained silent for a long moment. "Thomas Reed passed away 10 years ago," he said finally. "He was never prosecuted for what he did to you. That weighs on me." "On us too," Jason admitted, his voice holding a hard edge. "But we've learned to live with it." Before he left, the detective pulled a small, worn photo album from his coat. "I compiled this during the investigation. They're copies. You can keep them. I thought, maybe you'd want to see some of what you missed all those years." Susan opened the album with trembling hands. It contained photos of the children before they disappeared, newspaper clippings about the case, even a few pictures of Susan in the years that followed, attending vigils and events for families of the missing. "Thank you," she said, tears in her eyes. "This means so much." After the detective left, promising to stay in touch, the family returned to their Christmas tree. But the atmosphere had changed. A layer of reflection had settled over the earlier joy. "It's strange to think of all the lives we affected," Daniel commented, hanging a glittering ornament. "Not just Mom, but people like Detective Callahan. And Helen," Emily added. "She changed the course of her life for us." "We should do something to honor her memory," Michael suggested. "Something permanent." And so, in the days that followed, the idea of establishing a foundation was born. The Helen Winters Foundation for Children in Crisis was born from a shared purpose: to provide safe harbor and support for children suffering abuse or living in at-risk situations. "Helen always said the system fails the most vulnerable kids," Jason explained during a family dinner as they discussed the details. "This foundation could work to fill those gaps, to provide safe alternatives." The idea quickly gained momentum. Jason, with his expertise in computer systems, built a website. Emily, as an educator, began developing psychological support programs. Daniel, with his contacts in the medical field, established relationships with health professionals willing to offer pro bono services. And Michael, ever the pragmatist, started designing what he called safe houses, spaces specially designed to temporarily shelter children in emergencies. Susan watched with pride as her children transformed their traumatic experience into something positive. The tragedy that had defined their lives for so long was now a catalyst for helping others. Their first Christmas reunited was emotional beyond words. On Christmas morning, as the children ran excitedly toward the tree where gifts were piled high, a reflection of 25 years of missed occasions, Susan found herself momentarily overwhelmed. "Are you okay, Mom?" Emily asked, noticing her tears. For a moment, Susan was unable to speak. Finally, she managed to whisper, "For years I bought gifts that would never be opened, and now—" Emily hugged her tightly. "Now we're here, and we're not going anywhere." As winter slowly gave way to spring, the expansion of the house was completed. The result was breathtaking. It was a structure that respected the original architecture but expanded it harmoniously, creating spaces both private and communal for the extended family. "It looks like a small family compound," commented Kate, Michael's wife, as they toured the newly finished rooms. "Like one of those old European houses where several generations lived together." "Exactly what I had in mind," Michael confirmed, clearly proud of the result. For Susan, each day continued to bring small wonders, moments she treasured after so many years of solitude. Like when Jason, the most reserved of her children, began teaching her how to use the computer, showing infinite patience with her basic questions. Or when Daniel would join her on her morning walks, sharing stories from his years as a nurse. Or the afternoons spent baking cookies with Emily and the children, the kitchen filled with laughter and flour dusting every surface. One April afternoon, as Susan worked in the newly expanded garden, planting seeds for the family vegetable patch they had decided to start, Michael joined her, kneeling beside her in the damp earth. "Do you know what day it is today?" he asked, his voice quiet. Susan paused, thinking. "Tuesday, right?" Michael smiled softly. "Yes, but it's also the anniversary. It's been 6 months since we came back." Susan set down the small trowel she was holding, surprised that the time had passed so quickly. "Half a year. It seems like so long and no time at all." "Sometimes I wake up thinking it was all a dream," Michael confessed. "That I'm still in Quiet Valley and that I never worked up the courage to come back." "I have those moments too," Susan admitted. "But then I hear the kids running through the house, or Emily's voice singing in the shower, or Jason cursing when his computer freezes." She smiled. "And I know it's real." Michael took a handful of soil, letting it filter through his fingers. "We're planting roots again, literally." Susan nodded, looking at the neat rows of seeds they had planted. Tomatoes, carrots, peas. "Just like the garden your father and I had when you were little." "I remember," Michael said. "Daniel used to pull up the carrots before they were ready because he was too impatient to see how they were growing." They both laughed at the memory, then continued to work in silence for a moment. The only sound the gentle scrape of their trowels in the earth, and the birds singing in the nearby trees. "Mom," Michael said finally, his voice more serious, "are you happy with all this? Sometimes I wonder if we haven't invaded your space, changed your life too much, too fast." Susan put down her tools and took her eldest son's hands, his as stained with soil as her own. "Michael, for 25 years I lived in a limbo. I was existing but not truly living. Now I have my family back, bigger and more beautiful than I ever imagined. I have laughter in my house, purpose in my days, and love. So much love that sometimes I think my heart can't hold it all." She squeezed his hands. "So yes, I am immensely happy." Michael nodded, his eyes bright with unshed emotion. Together they returned to their task, planting seeds that would blossom in the months to come, tangible symbols of a new beginning, of roots spreading deep into familiar but renewed ground. The story of the Johnson siblings would continue to unfold with new chapters that would include both challenges and joys. But one thing was certain. After 25 years apart, they had found their way back home, closing a circle that had once seemed irreparably broken. Summer arrived in Maine with its characteristic splendor. Long days bathed in golden light, mild nights filled with the song of crickets and the lingering scent of wildflowers and freshly cut grass. For the Johnson family, it was their first summer reunited, and each day seemed to offer a new opportunity to create memories that would compensate, at least in part, for the 25 lost years. The vegetable garden Susan and Michael had planted in the spring was now thriving, providing an abundance of fresh vegetables that Emily transformed into elaborate family meals. The children spent hours playing in the sprawling backyard where Michael had built a treehouse that would have been the envy of any child in Millfield. The Helen Winters Foundation for Children in Crisis was also flourishing. What had begun as an idea born from shared pain had become a formal organization with a board of directors, dedicated volunteers, and its first safe house about to open in Portland. "I never imagined it would grow so fast," Jason commented one afternoon, showing Susan the updated foundation website. "We've received donations from all over the country." "People respond to stories of hope," Susan replied, looking at the photographs of the newly renovated house. "And ours, despite all the pain, is a story of hope." One Sunday in July, the family hosted a barbecue in the garden, inviting neighbors and friends who had been part of Susan's life during the lonely years. It was a way to thank them for their support and to integrate the past with the present. Margaret Wilson, an elderly woman who had been Susan's neighbor for decades, watched the scene with misty eyes. "For years I saw Susan move through that empty house like a ghost," she remarked to Emily as they both served potato salad onto paper plates. "Every birthday, every Christmas, every first day of school. She kept up those traditions as if you were all going to walk through the door at any moment. Many of us thought she was torturing herself, that she needed to move on, but she always said she felt it in her heart, that you were alive somewhere." Emily set the spoon down, moved. "She never gave up on you," Margaret confirmed. "Never. And now look at her." Susan was sitting at a table under a century-old oak tree surrounded by her 3 grandchildren. She was teaching them how to make crowns from wild daisies, her hands patiently guiding the children's small ones, her face lit by a smile that erased years from her features. "She's grown younger," Margaret observed. "It's as if she's gotten back not only her children but a piece of her own youth." The afternoon passed in a blur of laughter, conversation, and impromptu games in the yard. Michael started a bonfire as the sun began to set, and the family gathered around, roasting marshmallows and sharing stews. Daniel, who had always had a talent for narration, entertained the children with embellished, but carefully edited, versions of their adventures in Quiet Valley. Jason occasionally added a technical detail that made the adults laugh but went over the little ones' heads. "And what was Helen like?" asked David, Michael's son, with the insatiable curiosity of a child his age. "Was she like Grandma Susan?" The siblings exchanged a thoughtful look. "In some ways," Emily answered finally. "They're both strong, determined, and would do anything to protect the children they love. But Helen was wilder," Michael added, searching for the right word. "She had lived in the mountains for so long that she had become a part of them somehow. She knew every plant, every animal. She could predict the weather better than any meteorologist. And she made the best blueberry bread in the world," Daniel contributed with a nostalgic smile. "Except for Grandma's," David quickly corrected, shooting a loyal glance towards Susan. Everyone laughed. And Susan hugged her grandson, grateful for his innocent loyalty, but also aware of the complex feelings her children must have. Helen Winters had been, in many ways, a second mother to them during crucial years of their development. The gratitude Susan felt for this woman she had never met was inextricably mixed with a pang of jealousy for the moments she had lost. The first dates, the graduations, the heartbreaks and triumphs that Helen had witnessed in her place. Later that night, after the guests had left and the children were tucked in bed, Susan found Emily sitting alone on the back porch, watching the last embers of the bonfire glow in the darkness. "May I join you?" Susan asked. Emily nodded, shifting over on the wooden bench. "I was just thinking." "About Helen?" Susan ventured. Emily looked at her, surprised. "How did you know?" Susan smiled softly. "I recognize that look. I've seen it on all of you when you talk about her. It's a mixture of love and loss." "I miss her," Emily admitted, "and I feel guilty for missing her now that I'm here with you." "You shouldn't," Susan said firmly. "She loved and protected you when I couldn't. I will be eternally grateful for that." "She always talked about you," Emily said in a low voice. "She constantly reminded us that we had a mother who loved us, who was surely looking for us. She never tried to replace you." Susan took her daughter's hand. "I'm glad to hear that. I wish I could have met her to thank her in person." "She would have liked you too," Emily replied. "She always said we must have inherited our stubbornness from someone, and that you were surely a strong-willed woman." They both laughed, then sat in a comfortable silence, gazing at the stars that peppered the summer sky. "Mom," Emily said at last, "there's something I've been wanting to tell you, but I couldn't find the right moment." Susan turned to her, noticing a shift in her tone. "What is it, honey?" Emily took a deep breath. "I'm pregnant. 3 months." Susan's eyes widened with surprise and joy. "Emily, that's wonderful." "It's going to be a boy," Emily continued, a smile spreading across her face. "And I'd like to name him John, after Dad, if that's okay with you." Susan felt tears welling up in her eyes. "Oh, Emily, your father would be so honored." She hugged her daughter tightly. Another one, another member of this ever-growing family. The news of Emily's pregnancy was shared with the rest of the family at breakfast the next day. sparking a wave of congratulations and immediate plans to adapt one of the rooms in her apartment into a nursery. As the summer progressed, life found a rhythm. Michael had established a new carpentry workshop in a renovated old barn on the outskirts of Millfield, where he was already gaining a reputation for his excellent craftsmanship. Jason split his time between his remote work in cybersecurity and developing the digital infrastructure for the Helen Winters Foundation. Daniel had settled in perfectly at the regional hospital, where his natural empathy and clinical skills made him popular with patients and colleagues alike. And Emily, despite her pregnancy, was preparing to start teaching at the local school when the academic year began in September. One afternoon in August, as Susan was returning from the supermarket, she was met with a sight that stopped her in her tracks. Her 4 children working together in the front yard, planting a young maple tree. The scene was so ordinary and yet so extraordinary that she had to sit in the car for a moment, just absorbing it. Michael was directing the operation with his usual attention to detail, making sure the hole was the right depth. Jason held the slender trunk of the tree while Emily and Daniel, kneeling on the ground, worked to secure the roots with fresh soil and compost. Susan finally got out of the car and walked over, curious. "What are you guys doing?" All 4 looked up, smiling when they saw her. "Planting a memorial tree," Daniel explained. "For the anniversary." Susan tilted her head, confused. "What anniversary?" "Tomorrow marks exactly 10 months since we came back," Jason said, "and it would have also been Helen's birthday. We thought it would be fitting to plant something that will grow with us," Emily added, gently stroking her slightly rounded belly. "Something future generations can see and know our story." Michael came over to Susan, putting an arm around her shoulders. "What do you think, Mom? A symbol of new beginnings." Susan looked at the young tree, so fragile yet so full of potential, just like her reunited family. "I think it's perfect," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Absolutely perfect." That night, as Susan prepared for sleep, she reflected on how much her life had changed in less than a year. From overwhelming loneliness to a house full of voices and footsteps. From torturous uncertainty to the daily joy of watching her grandchildren grow and soon welcoming another. The pain of the 25 lost years would never completely disappear. But it was now a quiet undercurrent to a life overflowing with love. A testament not to what was lost, but to everything that had been found. There were gaps in her knowledge of her children's lives, voids that no amount of stories or photographs could ever truly fill. But every day brought new opportunities to know them as the adults they had become, to understand who they were now, and to create new memories together. As she drifted off to sleep, Susan thought of the young maple tree planted in her front yard. With time, its roots would dig deep into the Maine soil. Its branches would reach for the sky, offering shade and beauty to future generations of the Johnson family. It was a living testament that even after the longest, most painful absences, there is always the possibility of return, of reunion, of a new beginning. Autumn arrived in Millfield with its annual spectacle of brilliant colors and crisp air. The leaves of the maples and oaks transformed into hues of red, orange, and gold, creating a landscape that looked as if it were pulled from a postcard. The young maple in the Johnsons' yard, though still too small to fully participate in the display, showed a few reddish leaves on its slender branches, a promise of the autumns it would one day witness. A year had passed since the Johnson siblings' return. A year of readjustments, discoveries, joys, and the occasional difficult moment as they navigated the complex dynamics of weaving together lives that had followed separate paths for so long. It was a Saturday in October, almost the exact anniversary of their homecoming, and the Johnson house was buzzing with activity. Family, friends, and community members were gathering for the official inauguration of the first Helen Winters safe house on the outskirts of Millfield. The foundation had grown exponentially in the last year. What had begun as a small family project had evolved into a respected organization with professional staff, dedicated volunteers, and now, its first physical facility, a spacious house renovated specifically to provide temporary shelter for children in crisis. Suzanne watched with pride as her children, each in their own way, put the finishing touches on the preparations. Michael, with his eye for detail, was adjusting the welcome banner at the entrance. Jason was checking the security system one last time, ensuring every camera and sensor worked perfectly. Emily, her 8-month pregnancy now prominent, organized informational brochures and educational materials, and Daniel walked through the rooms with a medical checklist, making sure first aid kits and supplies were complete and accessible. "I can't believe how much they've accomplished in such a short time," commented Margaret Wilson, who had arrived early to help. "This house will be a lifeline for so many children." Suzanne nodded, her eyes misting over. "My children have transformed their pain into purpose. It's extraordinary." "You too, my dear," Margaret replied, squeezing her hand. "You are the heart of all this." The opening ceremony was simple but deeply emotional. The four Johnson siblings, standing before the entrance of the newly renovated house, briefly shared their story, explaining how their experience had inspired the creation of this refuge. "Helen Winters gave us a home when we needed it most," Michael said, his voice firm but laden with emotion. "She protected us, she educated us, she loved us. This house is our attempt to continue her legacy, to ensure that other children in desperate situations find the same kind of shelter and understanding that we did. We know there are situations where the traditional system can't respond with enough speed or flexibility," Jason continued. "This house will serve as a bridge, a safe place while permanent solutions are found." Emily, one hand resting on her belly, added, "As an educator and a soon-to-be mother, I firmly believe that every child deserves to feel safe, valued, and understood. That will be the core mission of this place." "And as a healthcare professional," Daniel concluded, "I pledge that every child who passes through these doors will receive not only physical care but also the emotional support they need to heal and grow." Susan, watching from the front row, felt her heart might burst with pride. Who would have imagined during those dark years of waiting and uncertainty that she would one day be here watching her children transformed into compassionate adults, determined to make a positive difference in the world? After a symbolic red ribbon was cut at the entrance, guests were led in small groups to tour the facility. The house, a carefully restored old Victorian mansion, featured cozy bedrooms, communal rooms for therapeutic and educational activities, a spacious kitchen where children could learn basic culinary skills, and sprawling gardens where they could play and connect with nature. Every detail has been considered from the perspective of a traumatized child, Emily explained as she guided a group. The colors, the lighting, even the arrangement of the furniture, everything is designed to create a sense of safety and calm. In a special room, a bronze plaque displayed a photograph of Helen Winters, an elderly woman with a kind face and piercing eyes, captured on her quiet valley porch surrounded by wildflowers. Beneath the photograph, a simple inscription read, "In memory of Helen Winters, 1925-2010. Who taught us that family is more than blood, and that courage sometimes means opening your door to those who need it most." In the mid-afternoon, when the formal events had concluded and guests were enjoying an informal buffet in the garden, Susan found a moment to retreat to the quiet front porch. She needed a breath, a moment to process the emotional intensity of the day. She hadn't been there long when she sensed a presence beside her. It was Kate, Michael's wife. holding 2 mugs of tea. "I thought you might need this," she said, offering one of the mugs. "It's been an intense day." Susan accepted the tea gratefully. "Thank you, dear." Kate sat beside her on the porch swing, and for a moment they both watched the autumn landscape in silence. "You know," Kate said finally, "when Michael first told me his story, I couldn't believe it. It sounded like something out of a novel. A boy who disappears with his siblings, grows up in an isolated community, and finally comes home after 25 years. She paused, taking a sip of her tea. "But what impressed me most was how he spoke of you, with so much love and remorse at the same time. He always knew the pain he had caused you." Susan felt a lump form in her throat. "Michael once told me that for years he had the same recurring nightmare," Kate continued. "He was in this house looking for you, but he couldn't find you. He would go through every room calling your name, but all he found were empty rooms, dust, and silence." Susan closed her eyes briefly, imagining the anguish of that dream. "And now we're all here in this house full of life." "Exactly," Kate smiled. "It's as if the circle is finally cleared." Just then, the porch door opened and Emily stepped out, her face a mask of surprise and slight discomfort. "Mom," she said, her voice a little tight, "I think it's time." Susan and Kate were on their feet in an instant, understanding immediately. "The baby?" Susan asked, though the answer was evident in the way Emily held her belly and breathed with careful concentration. Emily nodded. "The contractions started an hour ago, but I thought they were false alarms. Now I'm pretty sure they're not." The events that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Daniel, with his medical expertise, naturally took charge, checking Emily's vital signs and timing her contractions. Michael and Jason handled notifying the remaining guests and organizing the trip to the hospital. Kate stayed with Sophie and the other children, calmly explaining that they would soon meet their new cousin. In less than 20 minutes, Emily was in the back seat of Susan's car with Daniel by her side monitoring her, while Susan drove toward the hospital with a mixture of nerves and excitement. Michael and Jason followed in another vehicle, coordinating by phone. "It's fitting, don't you think?" Emily commented between contractions, a strained but genuine smile on her face. "A new beginning, exactly 1 year after our return." "Life has an interesting way of marking its cycles," Susan replied, glancing briefly at her daughter in the rearview mirror. The next few hours were a blur of anxiety, waiting, and finally indescribable joy when, at 8:17 p.m., John Michael Johnson arrived in the world with a strong, healthy cry. Susan, who had stayed by Emily's side through the entire delivery, was the first to hold her new grandson after his mother. As she gazed at the tiny, wrinkled face, so new and yet so familiar, she felt a door gently close in her heart and another swing wide open. "Welcome, little John," she whispered into the baby's ear. "We've been waiting for you." Hours later, with Emily resting and the baby asleep in his hospital bassinet, Susan found herself in the hospital cafeteria with her 3 sons. The 4 of them were sharing coffee and donuts at midnight, exhausted but too wired to go home. "Quite a full day," Jason remarked with his typical dry wit. "We open a house and welcome a new family member." "Helen would be proud," Daniel said thoughtfully. "Of the house, of us, of everything we've accomplished this year." Michael nodded, lost in thought. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if we'd made different choices, if we'd found the courage to come back sooner." "We can't change the past," Susan said softly. "We can only learn from it and move forward." The 4 of them sat in silence for a moment, each lost in their own thoughts about the strange and winding path that had led them to this moment. "You know," Susan said finally, "for years, I tormented myself thinking about what I could have done differently, how I could have protected you better. I blame myself for not seeing what Thomas was doing to you. She paused, her eyes scanning the faces of her sons, now adults with their own scars and triumphs. But now I realize that, despite all the pain and the lost years, we somehow ended up exactly where we were meant to be. Daniel reached for her hand across the table. Do you really believe that, Mom? Susan nodded, a quiet certainty in her gaze. I do. Look at all you've accomplished, who you've become. Look at the lives you'll touch through the Helen Winters Foundation. Her voice broke slightly. And now, with John's arrival, it's as if all the pain finally has a purpose. The four of them remained in the cafeteria late into the night, sharing memories, making plans for the future, and simply enjoying being in each other's presence. When they finally walked out to the parking lot, the sky was beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn. Susan paused for a moment before getting into her car, looking toward the horizon where the sun would soon appear. A new day, a new beginning, a family that, despite being torn apart by fear and circumstance, had found its way back to wholeness. Let's go home, she said at last, knowing that those two simple words held an entire universe of meaning for them. And as they drove under the sky, turning from black to deep blue, Susan reflected that some stories, even the most painful ones, can find their way to an ending that, if not perfectly happy, is at least full of hope, redemption, and the promise of better days to come.